What do these three excerpts have in common? First we heard Haydn, then Rachmaninoff, then a little of one of my own transcriptions of Puccini. Three distinctly different eras and styles of keyboard music, but the musical success of each of those passages is due in great part to understanding texture in sound. So what is texture? Texture can be a byproduct of dynamics, of register, of use of pedal, the contour of a melodic line, and or a counter melody. And of course, texture is a combination of all of these things simultaneously as well. A great composer is going to give us music where the components of that music are expertly separated into layers or tiers or voices. We can even also think about it as how a piece of keyboard music is orchestrated. Pianists who can show the listener these voices or this orchestration give us the most complex and usually the most enjoyable interpretations of music to listen to. So let's use these three examples to understand a bit more about texture. And we're actually going to work backwards, and we're going to start with my transcription of Puccini's O mio babbino caro, transcribed for left hand only. We're starting here for two reasons. First off, the compositional process in practicing this transcription is primarily what inspired this video. And secondly, working on any repertoire for just a single hand is always going to be a fantastic place to learn to see texture more clearly and to implement it in your playing, at least technically with the hand you're working on. And for most of us, I'd say left hand needs more work on this than the right hand. So here we are, O mio babbino caro. We're going to actually look at the second page and just a very short excerpt of this. As we continue through the three examples, the excerpts are going to get longer and longer. But for our sake, we're only going to look at measures 22, 23, and 24 in this particular example. Let's divide this up into basic textures and voices. Right at the top, we of course have melodic content. Now, the separation of melody versus everything else is always our most basic separation of texture, right? And we're going to find that in every piece of music from any era, from any genre, not just classical music, but into pop music and anything else you might play. Where do we have that in this particular piece? Because this is going to be more complex than just two layers. Melody, of course, is our top line. In this case, it's our top line. It doesn't always have to be. Identifying where it is important. So here, our melody is in yellow. Now, we have more stuff than that. Let's continue. We're just going to work from the top down. As we continue down, we have the rest of this. These are, in a sense, more complicated than just the little vertical highlights that I'm making. But we can see now there's a melody, but there's also a harmonic component. But let's continue on. There are more textures here. There are a couple different things going on the left hand. I'm putting these in red now. We'll even include that note. Let me do that again for you. So this, and here, and here. We're going to add something to that in a minute. So here, now we have a fourth layer or a fourth texture. And this is a combination of harmonic content, exploring more of what the surrounding harmonies are. So here's in beat 1, beat 2, we're halfway through the bar. We're exploring an A-flat major harmony through that. And this movement in the left hand is helping to explore that a bit more, right? And then it continues. So everywhere that is now highlighted in red is more of an exploration of harmony, but it's also something else. it's also, in a sense, a counter melody. We have our main melody on top in yellow, right? But then we have this. Sorry about that little wrong note there. Here we go. So those top notes in the red, and not just in the first bar, but then those are simple, but they could still be considered counter melody, especially when we get to the third measure. Here, 1 and 2 and 3 and that's definitely a line. And guess what? It also leads right into the pitch that's in the treble clef. So that becomes a crossover between two textures. Because now we can hear the melody on the top. Also aligning with this counter melody that's working in contrary motion. Neat stuff, right? This isn't just arpeggiation and simple accompaniment, right? And it doesn't end there. It doesn't end at the end of that beamed group. There's another connection. Yeah, and we could go further. It's all over this piece, right? There's one more texture, one more layer that we need to talk about, and that is our fundamental bass. Yeah, the first bar we don't really get any. It's implied that it's A flat because of everything else that's going on. But here, then we start to get more tones that are definitely fundamental bass, and they end up being pedaled. We obviously cannot hold on to them this whole time. 1. And that's providing more harmonic foundation for us, right? Okay, so we've identified 4 different, this is just in the writing of it, 4 different textures. Yes? Melody, then there's harmonic support for that melody, that's in green. And then there's the red, which is further harmonic support and counter melodic motion throughout the line. And then in blue, we have our fundamental of the harmony, or our bass. What does that mean for interpreting and performing a line of music like this? Well, first off, if we take just the treble clef by itself, we of course know that we have to bring out the top the most in our playing. That means when we have these, for example, we have 16ths that move us between eighth note beats. Those 16ths cannot be more important, or they can't be given too much dynamic and too much articulation. Otherwise, they will take away from the melodic movement. They'll take away from the melodic line. So we have to know and we have to see, obviously, not every note on the paper is as important as every other note, in a sense, if you know what I mean, right? Every note, of course, is important. We want to play them all. We want to represent the composer's intent the best we can, and we'll continue to do that in the other examples. But they are given tiers of importance, right? So our main melody is the most important. What's underneath that and supporting it cannot be as important. It cannot be pronounced as greatly. And one of the most common issues, and we're going to get into this in the next example, one of the most common issues is that when we have faster moving notes, they tend to cloud the correct separation of texture. So whenever we have melody, but then something under the melody is moving more quickly, we have to be really careful, right? Sometimes that's happening in one hand. Even if it's separated into 2 hands, it's that intensification of rhythm that can lead our ear astray and lead the listener's ear astray if, as performers, we're not careful about showing exactly how things need to be structured. So, if I just take the treble clef, the tops are the most important. So even here, in this last one that I just played, there is another melodic line in the middle of that as well, but it's not as important as the main melody. So let me just play them with 2 hands for you. First, And this is a great way to practice. Even if it's intended to be executed with one hand, we can really get a great sense of the separation of texture if we take it with two. Here's our first 16th. So we're obviously and very intentionally setting these on two separate planes. Now our job in performance with this is to make sure that all happens with one hand, not two. And then, of course, we have to add in the remaining textures. So, continuing to show phrase and direction, but on a separate dynamic plane than where the melody is. Perhaps with the same pedal, perhaps with a change. I was taking that a bit under tempo so you could really follow along and hear every single one of those different notes. So like I mentioned, repertoire for one hand is great to work on all of this because we have to practice voicing and separating out all of these different textures and layers with just a single hand without the aid of two hands. But if our ear needs that little bit of help, we can always practice left hand repertoire, right, a little bit with both hands, just to get our ear trained to say, this is how it's supposed to sound. This is the end product I want. This is the separation and dynamic. This is maybe the separation or articulation I want. Train our ear to hear that, and then we go back and put it in one hand. Let's jump over to another example. Okay, this is Rachmaninoff's famous Prelude, Opus 3, number 2 in C-sharp minor. Just about everybody that's into piano music has heard this piece, right? We're looking at the second page in my score, the agitato. And once again, let's take a quick dive and just separate out compositionally the different layers. We're going to go through this even more quickly than we did last time. So starting from the top, let's put our melody, our main melody in yellow. We have right? That's our first 4-bar grouping. We'll just do 4 bars, even though we're going to take this one a little bit further. Okay, next, moving down, we have this content I'll put in green again, and it's all these triplet figures. Once again, just like in the last example, it's always the fastest moving notes that have a tendency to take away from where we need to keep the listener's focus on the melody, right? So this piece, this is a very common one for, let's say, late intermediate, early advanced students to play. And one of the most common mistakes when we start learning the agitato is to play all of those notes. All of those notes equally loudly with equal dynamic. Well, that's a big mistake because now we're only seeing the triplet as one item instead of it being separated into two things. We have melody right? We also have the triplets, which include the first note, the melody note. Whoop. If I just play, that's a little weird to not play the melody out, but that's just the triplet figure, right? And if we add them together, we need to realize that upper line gets pronounced the most. Okay, in this particular piece, we're given the aid of them having stem directions that are opposite. Melody has stems up, this triplet figure all has stems down. That immediately shows us a difference on the page. That's really nice and really helpful. We don't always get that, even when we have to make the same decision that we just made. And that's going to be in the next example. Okay, third texture. Once again, we have this both harmonic movement and also counter melodic movement as well. So, of course, we could hear all of that working together. We're not focusing on what's in red, right? green, what's in red is also. And Rachmaninoff even gives us slurs to help indicate this is important in its melodic content, which means it can get a shape. Oh, that's interesting. We're going to come back to that in a second. Okay, last layer is our fundamental bass. And there are a couple places where this is shared with the layer that we just put in red. And that's right over here, these pitches, right? When the red texture and the blue texture, when they align, we're getting both the bass or the we'll call it, I know they're not always chord roots according to harmony, but we're going to call it the root, the foundation of our harmony, okay? Not theoretical roots, but the lowest pitch that is sounding, whatever inversion the chords happen to be in, okay? When those things align, then we have two purposes, we have two textures, let's say, that are maybe, so two separate purposes, but they're sharing them on single pitches. I hope that makes sense. When we understand the four textures that are in play here, that opens up more doors about interpretation. First of all, we know for sure we can't play out, at least at the beginning, the green too much. Because if we play it out too much, we obscure what the melody actually is. So we need to keep that layer tucked in. And understand that it's those triplets that are really giving the agitato feel, but we can't continue to play them out so much, right? Tying into that, right at the beginning on this particular line, this is getting into more interpretation, but we have a mezzo forte marking. This is also really important when it comes to differentiating textures in music. When we have a dynamic marking given by a composer, that dynamic marking is an overarching marking. It does not mean that every note in the line gets played, in this case, mezzo forte. No, not every note gets played mezzo forte. The overall dynamic intention of all of the notes put together is mezzo forte. And when it changes, when it crescendos, when it diminuendos, when we come back to mezzo forte, when it crescendos up to fortissimo later on the page, that is the combination of all pitches that is making that dynamic change. And how they're all ringing together, how they're all being utilized together. It does not mean that every pitch sounds fortissimo or every pitch sounds mezzo forte. Okay, we have two different melodic ideas that are happening here. There's the main one that we usually hear. Right? But there's also the one in red. Play those together and hear what that interplay between these two voices sounds like. That actually sounds a little bit like Bach in a sense. We have two distinct voices. They're singing out simultaneously. What else does that mean for us as pianists? We get a choice about, do we always want to bring out just the main melody? When there's other content that is very melodic, we can make a separate choice, especially when the composer in the bars that are coming gives us this content over again. So maybe at the top of the page, we bring out the top melody the most. But now, the fifth measure of the page, the second statement of this, we can choose to voice up one of the other layers, one of the other textures if we want to. Right? It's always a good practice. If we highlight one thing, what else, when the material gets repeated, what else can we highlight the second time around? The more complex the music is, the more choices we have about what that's going to be. In this case, we have a simple decision to make, whether we exchange dynamically the importance of the top texture with one of the middle textures, right? Let's also take this idea of texture and we're going to expand it now a little bit further. We've been talking on a measure-by-measure basis and a phrase-by-phrase basis vertically, right? But texture also exists in other kinds of ways. For example, we touched on this page starts mezzo forte, and it eventually crescendos to fortissimo. That dynamic change is also going to be a change in texture. Even if we had the same content, which we don't, that would be a change in texture to be aware of. The thing that a great composer like Rachmaninoff does for us is combine two changes to really make a large compositional change. So we're getting a repeat at the bottom of the page here. We're getting a repeat of the material, but it's not a literal repeat. It's up an octave for all the voices except the lowest one. So, yeah? When we do something like that, when a composer gives us something like that, he's changing not only the dynamic, which is now fortissimo, but also the registration. The registration has expanded. We still have the same layers, but because the registration is now covering a larger span of the keyboard, we have more intensity. It can be much more intense because we're utilizing higher pitches and sometimes lower pitches. In this case, staying just as low, but utilizing an octave up. Right? That's immediately more intense. This is darker, sure. Let's jump over to our third example, which is going to highlight all of what we've talked about and really a lot more as well. This is Haydn's Sonata in E-flat major, Hoboken 52. Haydn was, of course, a great composer, but also a master of showing musical surprise. And he shows us surprise in his music through manipulation of texture in the composition. Just this first page of the sonata is chock full of examples of manipulation of texture. Let's dive in. We're going to start at the top. We're going to go through quite a bit of the first page. All right? When we begin, we're not going to so much spend time on melody versus inner textures and things like that, but we're going to talk about a broader, bigger picture. Right in the very first measure, we have some large forte chords pronounced. Yes? There's, of course, melodic content and there's harmonic content, yes. But in a sense, these are working very much together because a lot of them are actually being played simultaneously. First chord. Okay, because of the registration, because of the closeness of pitches on the keyboard, this is a very thick texture, right? It's very thick and it's very strong and it's very triumphant, very grand because of that, right? Even into the second bar, where things change. So let's just call this grand, yes? Where things change is getting into the third bar. Our register changes immediately, right? We go from all kinds of vertical pitch content to, well, a bit less, and then only 2 pitches. So we're going from 4, 5, 6, 7 pitches sounding simultaneously. Beat 1, bar 1. By the time we reach our cadence in bar 3, 2 pitches, not 7 anymore. And 2 pitches that are 2 octaves away in register from where we started. What's another change that we have here? This beginning is going to have pedal, pretty thick pedal. Every harmonic change is getting a new pedal, but we have pedal down. Pedal, pedal, pedal. Third bar comes, no pedal. Right? We can tell that it's supposed to be no pedal because we have these rests that we need to make audible. And if we had the pedal down, those wouldn't be audible. Okay, third thing that Haydn has done, I'll put this in green. We obviously have a big change in dynamic from forte in bars 1 and 2 over to piano in bar 3. So there are so many ways Haydn has manipulated texture in these bars. They are fairly simply, if we look vertically as compared to the other pieces, we basically have melody and harmony. Yes, there isn't much else going on. But there is so much else going on when we dive into all of these other details. Dynamic, big change, right? Pedaling, using pedal versus no pedal, big change, right? And then the number of pitches used, 7, 7, 6, and then we have 4, 4, and then 2. Such a dramatic difference, right? When we're aware of all of those things, we can really understand why we're highlighting different things and what is the energy that gets put into different measures of Haydn's music. Let's go on to the next couple bars. We have some new content here at the end of bar 3. Right? We have contrary motion, thirds descending in the right, a single line in the left. What does this sound like? If you know your orchestration well, that sounds like wind instruments playing. Maybe flutes, maybe clarinet, 2 flutes on the top, clarinet on the bottom. Yes? Well, let's think about if this is winds, where did we come from? Is this the first time we're exploring winds in an orchestration type of way? Maybe. If we go back to the very first bar, we think about instruments that provide a lot of big sound and texture in orchestra. This could be strings, maybe strings in unison playing, dun, 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 and the rest of this is brass. That could be one possible orchestration. Brass plus your full string ensemble, that's going to be a lot of sound. It's going to be very thick. Well, in bar 3, we talked about the changes in numbers of pitch. Because of the registration change, does an orchestration change also happen? Maybe. Maybe winds enter in bar 3, the beginning of bar 3 here, instead of at the end of bar 3. Maybe this is supposed to be flutes or single flute. It could be something different too. This is just one particular example, right? This could be oboe, and this could still be strings. Something like that, right? But then the texture changes, and then the texture changes again at the end of the bar. And then when we have forte, another dynamic change, yes? This, once again, could be new instruments. It could be flutes and strings re-entering, if this was flutes and clarinets. Now, flutes and strings. Oops. Right? That change in texture, that change in orchestration, in instrumentation, changes how we interpret the piece. It changes how we play it. Yes? If we think about the brightness of flutes and the clarity of them, that means this is probably going to get no pedal, right? When strings come in, we're going to maybe pedal this a little bit and give a touch of blur to that first slur marking. Think about how strings in an orchestra play. When they play quickly, a very good orchestra, of course, we're going to play the pitches, they're going to play well, but string sections have a little bit of natural blur to them, if you will. We can imitate that on the piano with a little bit of pedal, not so much that it sounds like the wrong period of music. It's not Debussy, right? So it's not that blurry, but just a little bit. And then when the slur goes away, oh, so many interesting things that are happening in this piece. So now, in bar 3 into bar 4, we have a new registration again, new instruments. And then something else new. New dynamic, new instruments, decrescendoing. Once again, we get into measure 6. There are so many possibilities of what this could be. Here we simply have just a melody with an accompanimental type figure, almost like an Alberti bass figure. Whoops, there it is. Maybe this could be something like if you imagine a string orchestra going. One of those pulsing, just very light on the bow, pulsing motions that we hear a lot of in music from this type of, this time period. That could be something that's happening that the piano is imitating with this back and forth motion. If you can hear that extra texture and what that's supposed to be, and the subtle but extra intensity, like I said, the extra drive that gives it, this isn't just a faux Alberti bass pattern anymore, but it has so much more purpose. And what's the melody? What instrument is that? It could be strings, it could be oboe again. And then, here's another interesting thing. So we're kind of moving more quickly now. But we have all of this, let's put this in red. We've got very legato and smooth content through all of here. And then it gets chopped by two interesting little detached chords. So once again, Haydn is showing us surprise, and he's changing texture. Now changing texture through articulation and varieties of articulation, right? Do we see that? Smooth. And then opposite. And then once again, immediately hitting us with forte in a new register. Oh, it's such cool music. And Haydn, he just does so much with it. And most of the time, he's giving it to us on the page. So as long as we're looking for it, we can see all kinds of decisions that we need to make. And we can know when to exaggerate some of them. Yes? How big is forte? How quiet is piano? Well, what's the purpose behind them? Right? When we have the first bar, this is a big entrance. That should be quite a loud forte. Even though this is from 1794, instruments were nowhere near the size of our modern piano. They weren't capable of the same amount of sound, but it can be big, forte. When piano happens, 2 bars later, that is supposed to be such a dramatic change. It doesn't have to be just piano. We could almost think about this as starting fortissimo and quieting down to pianissimo. We can exaggerate that to show the elements of surprise and show the changes in texture that Haydn's giving us. Something at the end of the line. When the winds come in, maybe an echo. And then when forte happens, this is hitting us out of nowhere. There's a rest. Right? Ta-da-da-da. Down to piano. Smooth. Smoothness is once again in contrast to all of these, which, notice, there is no slur mark. There was at the beginning of, and then it goes away. Right? Let's keep going. I'm just going to talk you through a little bit more. Smooth. And then detached, quiet, loud. Now a new run that's just sparkly, and you have 2 options interpretively, of course, with this. We could play a crescendo all the way down to the bottom, which, if we do that, then we get this another added surprise of saying if we end with a crescendo to forte, that was the wrong direction, a crescendo to forte, then we have piano that happens after that. And that's a big, big, big surprise. But of course, we could also choose to say, well, I'm going to try to keep the run a little more even, sparkly at the top, and then kind of vanishing as it goes away, goes down to the bottom, yeah? So. And then we can play something like that, and it leads us to piano. This is like our previous smooth section that I highlighted in red, except the voices are flipped. Now left hand is taking the main melodic content. Now this is one of the spots I wanted to really highlight, and it's going to be the last thing that we talk about today. When we get into measure 14, there is actually quite a lot going on here. So now, for the first time really in this piece, we have more than two simple voices happening. We have our bass, which we always put in blue before, so here it is in blue again. We have a lower voice that's played with the left hand, so I'm going to put that in red. And we have all kinds of moving notes throughout all of that. And what's not marked, and this is why we always need to look out for stuff like this, what's not marked is the potential of these notes to be a counter melody. Or are they supposed to be the main melody? That's very interesting, and it's on the top. Or is the main melody supposed to be that? Well, there's argument both ways. The left hand was the focus leading into this. Back in bar 11. So would we can keep the focus there on the left hand? Or second time around, would we change it to the right? So many choices. And that particular one isn't given to us. There are so many places in the repertoire where those counter melodies or where opportunities to bring out texture and to see texture in a different way, they aren't presented with different stem directions, and composers don't always show us them on separate lines. Yes? Here's just one example of that. There would be more examples, even continuing on this page. There's more examples. Here we go. Bum, 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 bum. There's more detached notes. Are those important melodic ideas? Should we focus on the left? It's not as interesting. This is part of the reason I saved Haydn for last. There is just so much happening, really, in every measure, from one measure to the next measure to the next measure. And there's so much interplay between upper voices and middle voices and lower voices and changes in register and changes in dynamics. Yes? And Haydn, being a great composer, has given a tremendous amount of that to us as performers on the page. And it's our job to see all of it and make sure that we implement all of those different textures in performance. And what we didn't do with this piece, giving things kind of a hierarchy of importance, yes? We didn't talk about mostly melody versus other aspects until the bottom of the page. But we could go through and do that also from measure 1. We focused with this piece instead on seeing more broad changes in how Haydn manipulates texture, right? But we could also go back and in bar 1 say, well, this is the melody. I need to bring that top note out the most. Well, of course we do. How much do we bring out the lowest note, maybe? Do we bring out that lowest E flat more or less? That changes, it changes how the piece sounds. It changes how grand it is. It changes the other underlying emotion. So we don't want to skip those steps either, but this piece was just such a great example of how deep and expansive understanding musical texture and phrasing and how to implement it at the keyboard and how to exaggerate it at the keyboard and why it's so important in giving a good performance. Some of you might be wondering, why isn't any Bach being demonstrated here? And that's a good question. Bach's music is typically a place where we talk about multiple voices and handling 3 or 4 or even 5 voices in just 2 hands. Now, the way that we learn voices in Baroque music is important, but I find that for a lot of pianists that even after Bach has been explored, the concepts of voices and textures doesn't seem to get applied to classical music and Romantic era music and beyond. That's the reason that I chose to give examples in genres and eras outside of Baroque classical keyboard music. So when you're learning, always be on the lookout for not just melody versus accompaniment, which is the simplest separation of texture. But what else can you find in every phrase of every piece that you're studying that can add more dimension to your playing? Seeing notes and rhythms and understanding what they are is like seeing music in one dimension. Understanding melody versus harmony and seeing two basic textures is like seeing music in two dimensions. Going beyond that and coming to understand how dynamics and register and our use of pedal and articulations are employed both on the page by the composer and also how they might be implied by the music, even though they're not explicitly stated on the page. When our understanding is this deep, then we have the ability to see music in three dimensions, and we can create stunning and moving performances. I hope you found this video helpful. I'm Szczepanek, and I'll leave you today with just a bit more of that Haydn that we talked about.